All right, good afternoon, everyone. I'm so pleased to see you at our special live webinar today. I'm Marie. I'm the Market Manager at Spire Research and Consulting. Today, we'll be talking about our favorite topic, food, and we'll be looking at the changes that has been happening in the food industry and discuss the trends and opportunities that businesses in the industry should be aware of. Let me introduce our speakers. First, we have Japnit. Japnit Singh is our Spire's Deputy CEO. He'll be sharing with you the recent Spire survey, which is done through reaching out to the almost 2,000 Southeast Asian F&B companies in our database. Japnit will reveal the F&B trends to watch, the shift in consumer preferences, and what the new norm would be. And next we have Lionel. Lionel Wong is the co-founder and managing director of Upgrown Farming Asia. Upgrown Farming is a Singapore-based agri-tech company that has worked with companies in indoor farming, vertical farming, and greenhouse hydroponic solutions in Asia and Canada. And we have Rinka Banerjee, who is the founder and managing director of Thinking Foods, a food and nutrition research and development company, which helps companies develop new product concepts, as well as market viable commercial products. Thank you all for taking time out for our webinar today. So now, without further ado, I'll let Japnit show us his deck.
Sure. Thanks, Marie. You can hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Okay. Thanks once again, Marie. I'm going to take about 10 minutes or so and really talk about an initiative that we're working on here at Spire, and really some of the results and some of the interesting findings that have come out of it. So, as you rightly mentioned, Marie, food is a very exciting sector. We were just talking about it last week in our, Spire show as well. And as a part of that, here at Spire, we've started compiling a database of food companies, local companies here in Southeast Asia. We believe that this is a very exciting time. And these companies are, it's not really just a listing, but what we're doing is we're reaching out and we're talking to these companies and establishing a connect with these companies. Through that, we've also done this survey that I want to talk to you about here today. So we've started this initiative in Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore. We've got about 500 to 200, 700 odd names per country, close to about, as you mentioned, 2,000 people, companies across Southeast Asia. And what we're really focusing on is the lesser known entities. They are large in their countries, but internationally they are, they're not the big boys. So really, we're talking about the tier 2 companies, still very, very well established and sizable. We have cut across, and this is important to keep in mind as I share the findings as well. So we've cut across different product categories. So we are talking to alcohol beverage wholesalers, food manufacturers, beverage manufacturers, grocery stores, also people in the supply chain, as well as farmers. So both agriculture as well as livestock and aquaculture companies. And primarily what we're doing is getting the basic information about these companies and also understanding what their outlook is, what their needs for partners are, because we're hoping to do a lot of partner matching through this initiative. Okay, so before I start sharing, what some of the big trends are, just to lay the groundwork on Southeast Asia. So, the overall food industry is close to about 300 US billion. A lot of that is coming from Indonesia. Indonesia is the largest market, especially for processed foods. Second is Thailand, and then Vietnam. But also, if you look at food service, these are fairly large markets. Philippines is something I want to highlight. It's a fairly sizable food service market, although there's a lot less of processed food manufacturing that happens there, but it's a very vibrant market in terms of food service. And then, of course, you've got Singapore, which is a relatively smaller market. Okay. Now, you started off, Marie, by saying, food is important. I'm trying to put some numbers around that. Now, if you look at the per capita expenditure of different countries, expenditure on food in Vietnam goes as high as 35% of the per capita GDP. In Singapore, it's a lot lesser, but these are substantial numbers, and you see different countries behave differently, and they look at food in very, very differently as well. Okay, so I thought I'd put some of these numbers down in terms of calorie intakes. So on an average, the calorie intake crosses about 2,700 calories per day across the major markets. Singapore, unfortunately, didn't have data, but you see, sort of Vietnam is at the lower end of this rather narrow spectrum, and then on the other side, you've got Malaysia, which is almost reaching 3,000 calories per day. And you see that across these countries, although they're all neighboring countries, and when you're looking at it from as far as the US, which a lot of our clients are, or as far as Europe, Southeast Asia looks like one cluster, but the food habits and the food practices are actually quite different, and that is what we're sort of trying to show here. So even things like animal protein versus plant protein, you can see how in places like Vietnam, the proportion for plant-based protein is actually higher than your dairy and your milk and meat products. Also, interestingly, so Vietnam sort of stands out as just being more healthy in terms of their dietary habits. So if you look at this dark brown bar here, which is sugar, so it's percentage of calories that come from sugar, you can see that Vietnam sort of is at a much lower, it's a much thinner bar. Also, the intake of grains and pulses is quite high in Vietnam, also quite high in Indonesia. And one other interesting thing here, and the bars are small, so we haven't put the numbers in, but it's fruits and vegetables. So Vietnamese consumers eat more fruits and vegetables as a proportion of their diet compared to any of the others. So, Vietnam seems to have more healthy food, low sugar, more vegetables, sort of a thing. But the idea for me to show you this was really, show you sort of how diverse the dietary habits and the food cultures really, really are. Okay, so I want to talk about sort of these 5 trends that we're seeing, and these have come out of the conversations that we've had in the survey that we've conducted. There's also a lot of other data out in the public domain. So I've mixed and matched that into my presentation, but sort of 5 stories to tell you very quickly. The first one is the trend on home dining. Now, I think this is an old story already. There's lockdown, people aren't going out as much. But what's interesting is that consumers are saying that even post-pandemic, they expect that they're going to be going out a lot less. So you see China sort of do that very, very prominently, Hong Kong as well, but even Southeast Asia, all the way up to Philippines, where we're seeing sort of a half and half happen. In Japan, they expect things to go back to as before. Indonesia as well. More people expect that things will go back to as before. But in all of the other countries, we're seeing that even post-pandemic, people are going to be eating more at home. Just in our survey as well, food companies have started saying that convenience has actually become a very important decision maker. 96% of the companies said that this is now a top of mind as they're designing products or offering services to their consumers. And that sort of ties in with a McKinsey report that said, depending on the countries in Southeast Asia, between 30 and 70% of consumers have shifted away from their current suppliers. And that's because of availability. So companies that took a longer time to catch up with the whole COVID home delivery, home dining thing, they've had a long-term damage actually, and it doesn't look like it's going to get reversed even after the vaccines are out and well distributed. Okay, so what does home dining mean? And, two observations that we've seen. One is a domestication of the dining experience. So the consumption experience is being tried to, consumers are trying to bring that home, and you see that with the rise of bakeware, for example, the rise of coffee machines, for example. All of this stuff, equipment that used to be the domain largely of food service sector, is now becoming consumerized, and consumers have started buying a lot of these equipments as well. The other area, I think, is ready-to-eat meals. So this is the frontier that started off with a boom in Japan, but now Vietnam, we're seeing a huge amount of growth since 2014, close to about 20% per annum growth of ready-to-eat meals that people buy and then heat up at home and consume at home. The other sort of area that we're seeing is the rise of alternative diets and a shift towards health and wellness. And that conversation actually to a very large extent is changing. So you were seeing over 77% of the companies believe that now their customers are more mindful of what's going inside the food. So the ingredients at the back end have have become very, very important now. We're also seeing a high level of awareness about protein and healthy aging. So 38% of the consumers in Thailand associate a high protein diet with healthy aging. The other interesting one, of course, is plant-based alternatives. And impossible meat is something, at least in Singapore, we've started to see that very, very prominently. Also, from our surveys, we're seeing that 79% of the consumers are now saying that there is a change, that's coming in their diet, and the food companies are preparing for it. They've started really actively looking at that. So, and the impossible meat, I think right now has reached the food service. It hasn't reached consumers just as yet. You don't see it in the grocery stores just as yet, but there's a lot of interest around this sort of new product. The last sort of trend that I wanted to highlight, sub-trend in this whole health and wellness, is eating light and eating right. And what we're seeing really is the conversation and the marketing communication for brands is changing. It's not so much about cutting out the bad ingredients in your food. It's about adding in more beneficial products for you. So, so it's really the better for you snacks or alternatives that natural health alternatives that have started to take front and center stage. No surprises here. There is a greater demand for food safety and food authenticity. Clean label is something that consumers are becoming a lot more conscious about. Consumers are saying, and this is in Indonesia, which is really, Indonesia in our experience has been a very largely taste-based decision-making. So if it tastes good, never mind how much fat it has, Indonesian consumers to a very large extent base their decisions on that. But more than 50% of them are now saying that they're looking for natural attributes. So, we're seeing that sort of a change. A lot of companies, including our clients, have started to look at traceability, identity preserved grains, for example, farm to table supply chains, and showing that transparency and communicating that transparency has become very important. And of course, because of this, shopping behaviors are changing. So in Vietnam, for example, more consumers have shifted to supermarkets, to the organized channels, because they feel that that's cleaner. And of course, they are cooking a lot more at home. We were talking about how consumers are bringing the dining experience into the homes. And the other thing that we're seeing there is, of course, um, the growth of the premium segment. So in the surveys that we conducted, 85% in Indonesia, 80% in Malaysia, slightly lower in Singapore, but significant number of these companies said that the customers are now willing to pay premium if quality ingredients are being used. So it goes back to that ingredient conversation to a very large extent as well. I think what we're seeing is that consumers who've been locked in at home, haven't traveled, haven't eaten out, they've been looking for an outlet for them to indulge, and offering this quality products has become an avenue for them to do that. Uh, there's a story about Caviar Colony in Singapore where their caviar sales and new customers have come on, and all of this is happening at home. So it's all home consumption that's really rising. Um, the next sort of trend that I mentioned was this area around sustainability. So the food companies that we surveyed, 77% of them across the region said that sustainability is becoming increasingly important. Now, what that means, I think, still remains ambiguous. Lionel, I mean, you're in that industry, so I'm hoping that you can talk about this a little bit. But the buzzword around, so the buzz around sustainability as a word, I think is growing, and companies want to get into that. It's very important to do it sincerely, and we see a lot of misfires there. And the other area, of course, is around future proofing for food security. So Singapore, of course, has, the government's come out and said we're going to have 30% local produce, for example. But we're also seeing that in a lot of the other Southeast Asian governments, where the government's coming in and considering interventions that increase export readiness of their agricultural produce and increase farmer productivity. So these are areas that I think we're going to see more of. A lot of this might be coming in from the government interventions and policy changes. Okay, so what are we expecting to happen post-COVID? And when I say post-COVID, I mean once we're all vaccinated. Indonesian companies are saying that the competition overall is going to reduce. So some companies have suffered already. Recovery, as I mentioned, customers are sticky. Recovery is going to be difficult. But Indonesia specifically, I mean, all the companies said competition is going to reduce. A majority of companies across the 3 markets that we surveyed said that they're now going to actively expand. So, and internationalization is going to be one of the avenue routes, but we are gearing up for growth, and these companies are saying that once the crisis is over, they bounce back. The other area, I think, is around shift to local suppliers and local ingredients. In Singapore, in Indonesia, for example, 91%, almost everybody said that their customers prefer local ingredients. And you're seeing very high numbers in Malaysia as well. Singapore, I mean, granted, a lot of our food is imported already. And then sort of the last area, we spoke about sustainability, but you can see how Singapore, Malaysia at 77%, Indonesia, it's again in the 90s, 91% of these companies are saying that sustainability is going to be something that needs to be addressed. Yeah, so I'm going to end with that, but also hopefully give Lionel and Rinka some food for thought, no pun intended. But 4 or 5 things that I want to say there is, one, I think we are expecting changes, a radical growth in the food sector, specifically in Southeast Asia. Some of that innovation, or a lot of that innovation, is going to be around the health, better for you theme, and around sustainability. We're also going to see domestic agriculture in each of these countries see some sort of a productivity boost, and government action sort of coming in there. Indonesia is a market that we're studying very actively for this. I mentioned COVID-19, once it's over, there is going to be active and aggressive growth that the companies are saying they're going to do. Home-based consumption is going to stay steady. So direct to customer or direct to consumer channels, I think will be something that are going to be important. And of course, localization. So this is going to continue, probably get a little bit more aggressive, especially with multinationals and international exporters that are exporting to Southeast Asia. They will need to figure out how to localize and mitigate that threat that consumers are shifting to more local. Yeah, so that's sort of some of the findings that I wanted to share. I'll hand back to you, Marie.
Thanks, Japnit. That's it was quite interesting and enlightening. You've gone over your time limit, buddy.
I am so sorry.
Okay, so now, well, lastly, you talk about domestic agriculture and localization. I think that would be something Lionel would be able to bring us through, especially, I suppose, talking about indoor farming trends, and maybe even if the pandemic has any impact or hasten some of the trends. Lionel?
Thanks, Marie. Hi, everyone. My name is Lionel. I run Upgrown Farming. We are an agriculture consultancy firm. We mostly serve commercial growers across Asia, and we're seeing a lot of the trends that Japnit was talking about in his presentation. And I think I can share some of our experiences as well as some of the case studies that we've seen in the space. For the most parts right now, traditionally Asia or Southeast Asia specifically has always been, focused on agriculture. But I think there's a trend in terms of a slight shift in the strategies and also the approaches. Obviously factoring considerations for sustainability and other changes as well in terms of urbanization and I suppose the movement of people into cities. That's one of the major influence as well. That's slightly influencing how a lot of the traditional food production methods and strategies are being increasingly affected and changing as well. So I think to begin with, a good way to look at it is I think we are obviously seeing a huge development in the space of controlled environment agriculture, right? So what that means is essentially farmers and growers are growing it in environments where they can literally control most of the elements in there. The significantly less reliance on the traditional environment and the soil and water and things like that. There's a lot of what I call significantly reduced usage of pesticides and things like that as well, right? So that's also because of the consumer demand for cleaner and healthier foods, and that's causing a lot of the farms to change their strategies as well. Not just because it is more profitable, but that's also because the consumers are asking for it, right? So that's one of the I guess main observation that we can see, cleaner foods. In terms of climate change, that's another pretty big factor as well that we are noticing. For example, just in Malaysia and Singapore, right? In the last 10 years, I think, we have seen a significant change in our temperatures and our humidity, and even the monsoon seasons are kind of shifting as well, from year to year. So, for example, last monsoon season, between November and January, we had such heavy rains, and essentially in that period, if you're growing it, outside of controlled environment in the ground, in the soil, you're basically going to be stopped. Your production is going to be halted for that few months. You cannot really start your plants. There's not enough sunlight. But meanwhile, growers that have, I guess, upgraded or are growing in controlled environments, they're enjoying better pricing, during these periods, right? So this is where technology comes in, and this where, like, it's not always a straight line in terms of business models. And that's definitely going to be a growing trend in the space as well, like, which is why we're seeing a lot of companies coming to the space. And on the company front, that's also really interesting, because it's no longer just like, a conventional, like, second or third generation grower that is taking over the family businesses. Today, companies that are coming into farming are corporates, MNCs, that typically has no, like, background or history in farming at all, but they're coming into the space not necessarily because they are interested in farming, but I think one of the main reasons is, like, they need control over their supply chain, and in a way, like, there's a lot of vertical integration involved as well. So it's very interesting to see. Like, I mean, we have been operating in the agriculture space for a while. I would say, like, close to 8 years. Um, when when the industry first started moving into, like, modernization, at least into indoor farms, like, most of the new players are startups, like individuals that are starting farms. But today, like, these are like organized corporates, may not be educated, but there is actually structure and a strategy to go in place. So that is what is going to make the industry sustainable, because it's going to be backed by like proper objectives. It's not just necessarily based on a return on investment, like in 5 years. There's actually a educated approach towards it, right? So the technology gap, fortunately, is not a difficult problem to solve. Companies like ours, like basically provide like solutions for any company to come into space pretty easily. And I think the key part of coming into the agriculture space is really figuring out, like, what is the strategy, right? And that includes, like, understanding the market and the consumer requirements, and what is the target market essentially that wants to focus on. Yeah. So happy to answer questions, like later on, and I think I'll leave it as such for now.
Thanks, Lionel. Well, later on, I'd like to ask you about, the corporate going to farming, as you said, because of control over supply chain. But and I like to know, like, I know it's sustainable for them, but in terms of sustainability as a whole, where would that stand? But we'll keep that to, our panel discussion. So now I'd like to invite Rinka to tell us more about R&D in food and nutrition, and what trends perhaps you've seen, or what new things are hitting the market. Over to you, Rinka.
Great, thanks, Marie. Just 1 second, I'm going to share. Just hold on. Is my screen visible? Yep. All right, great. So thank you so much, Marie, for having me over. And it's fascinating to hear. It's fascinating to hear both Japnit and Lionel. And I think what I will speak probably will overlap a bit with what they've already said. But I'd like to try and bring some of the trends that we see into real products that are coming out in the market today. And so I'll just go through that. So just a little bit about what I do and what the company is about. We are essentially an R&D solutions partner to the food and nutrition industry. And what we do really is provide end-to-end R&D solutions. So really taking a product right from an idea stage from a concept all the way through to a commercial product in the market. We've been around for about 7 years now, and our team is essentially people with very strong domain expertise in the area of product or packaging, manufacturing, nutrition, and so on. And then we also have a team which has got a very solid business and technical credentials. The other part of what we do is essentially have a very strong ecosystem partners who we work with around the globe, who bring in expertise in different areas as and when we need them. Yeah. Right. So just a little bit about what we do. Essentially, like I said, we do an end-to-end program for startups as well as larger companies, where we really start from ideating on the product idea and really getting the strategy right, all the way through prototyping it, validating it, checking the regulatory, commercializing it on a manufacturing scale, and so on. And then the other part of what we do is more about services, where it's more around advisory around various areas of food and nutrition. So in the last 7 years, I would say we've actually worked with about 25 plus brands that we've helped launch in the market. A large chunk of them would be startups. Quite a few of them are larger companies who are getting into new categories. So with about 100 plus products, and we probably would have contributed so far, I'm sure it's a bit more than this, but probably more than $30 million in terms of revenue. So what I want to speak about now is a little bit about the behavior shifts that we're seeing in consumers, right, which is driving innovation. And Japnit, I think, covered some parts of it, and I will try and cover within those some of the things in terms of how do they impact in terms of product launches that we see in the market. So undoubtedly, well-being is the biggest driver or the biggest trend that we see in the food and the nutrition industry today. And I'll split this up into two parts of well-being, right? So one is about the whole physical well-being. And this is something that we had seen even pre-COVID, where you had people going to gyms and there was a lot around physical fitness, so people becoming a lot more athletic and stuff like that. There's another part of well-being, which has kind of really emerged post-COVID and during COVID, is the whole space of more around mental and emotional well-being. And I'll cover a little bit about that as I go along. The other part, I think, is value, and we all are aware that Asia per se is a very, very value conscious, societies in different countries in Asia, and that kind of reflects in terms of the amount of expenditure that we have on food from a per capita perspective. When you look at value, and I was just reading through a lot more of articles as well as looking at products that are coming out in the market today, value means a little bit different in terms of just when COVID started to being a very stockpiling kind of a mindset, to a point where really reassessing and saying, do I really want to spend money on this? If I want to spend money on this, why should I spend money on this? What is the benefit it gives me? I think people are beginning to reassess that. So I think that's something that is important. Mindful is something that Japnit spoke about. And I think this is, again, something that we've seen, from really, pre-COVID, it was a lot about, I've got a whole bunch of stuff in my product, I'm healthier for you and stuff like that. But I think now people have got a lot more mindful in terms of what is really going into my product. While we did have some things around immunity, etc., becoming very, very big during COVID, but I think it's also a lot about, are these ingredients intuitively making sense? So people are becoming a lot more mindful about what they are eating. Now, gratification, and I will cover a bit about that. I think earlier people went and spent a lot more out of home, and today people are cooking in home. People are making a lot of things in home rather than being out, and therefore there's a lot of experience of customization as well that's happening. So people are beginning to experiment a lot, cook a lot, and therefore they are trying to really get a lot of stuff around trying out new cuisines, for example, new ingredients. So there's a lot of experimentation that's happening, a lot of social media posting, etc., and that's giving gratification as well. And I'll cover a bit about that. And the last part is really about identity, and I think that is something that we see quite a few companies now beginning to do a lot more of. Like, what do you really stand for? What is the whole philosophy of this brand, but what is the purpose of this brand as well, and what do you stand for? And I think that's another thing that we're seeing, a lot of the behavior shifts in consumers, which is reflecting in the positions of the brand. Yeah. So just to speak about this whole area of mental and emotional well-being, and I was looking at it also from the products that are getting launched in the market, and we can clearly see a lot of it is in that space. So when I was just looking at some data, and again, this is, I think, some Mintel data, which is about, my family's stress levels and how much does it worry me and so on. If you see in Asia, countries like Philippines, India, and the data that's here, it's actually quite high. It's about 53%. India was 45%. So it's quite high percentage of people saying there is a lot of anxiety, there's a lot of stress at this point, and therefore there are products that are coming out there which are in some ways dealing with it, right? Either it's straight away or nutraceutical product which deals with stress, but there's another aspect of stress relief, and that is where it links up a bit to gratification, is also about brands or products around chocolates or beverages and so on, which is coming up with things which are more multisensorial, which really kind of tickle your senses. It's different colors, textures, aromas, things like that. And that in some way is also linked to the feeling of, feeling good, feeling less stressed and so on. So I think that it's a very interesting space where we see a lot of innovations already happening and potential for a lot of innovations to happen. The other big area that we see is really about mindful eating. And like I was mentioning earlier, while it is also about looking at ingredients which intuitively make sense, for example, but it is also, in some ways about saying, is this product, just a bit, bit of something and nothing, or is it nutritionally dense? And this is something that we are seeing a lot of companies and a lot of briefs that we get in the front end in terms of the product design briefs that we get. We do get a lot of briefs today, which is saying that we would like to make it fairly nutritionally dense. It's not about just giving one ingredient and saying that's my hero and that's all I'm all about, but it's about being more wholesome. Am I giving all the different, the proteins, carbs, and so on, or am I higher in a particular kind of active ingredient and stuff like that. So this is something that is becoming more and more. People are getting more and more aware of, and companies are also dealing with this, a lot more of. Yeah. The other part which Japnit also spent, and I'll just spend a little bit of time on this, is about really the fact that a lot of people are, of course, cooking at home. I think some parts of it initially, when it started off, in fact, with COVID, it was a lot about safety, right? So people didn't go out to eat. In fact, I also have a brand where I'm, a co-founder of, where we just saw the same trend, because that's a cooking solutions brand. And we found that people were trusting a packaged food a lot more than ordering in or getting food from outside. So there was a bit about food safety. There was a bit about value, of course, which is, you're cooking at home. It's a lot more, from a value perspective, makes a lot more sense than going out every day and ordering in and stuff like that. So I think that has sort of changed quite a bit. And we're seeing a lot of innovations happening in this space in terms of how do you make ready to cook meals, ready to eat meals in this space where people can cook quickly, but can have the pleasure to recreate, pleasure to innovate at home, so become like home chefs. And I think this is an interesting space that we see. Like I mentioned about value, and I think this is something that Asia has always been, very, very conscious of, right? So we are value conscious consumers. And, and I was just looking at, again, some data where I think Thailand was showing that healthy food is just way too expensive. But I think the whole point around, how do you market value, right? Like, what is the value you bring on this product? Why should it be more expensive? I think articulating that and giving the right benefits in a product is becoming more and more important. So while people are looking at quality, safety, do you stand for something, which means it's around social responsibility and so on and so forth. But also, if this is really genuinely giving me a particular health benefit and so on, is it validated? People are willing to put in more money for that. So I think that is something that we need to be very conscious of, as to how are we driving the whole perception of value in consumers' mind. So some of the brand responses I was seeing, to COVID early in the early days, I would say, is of course to bring, launch products or bring in their products with a position related to COVID, which was either, it just keeps you strong, healthy cooking at home, or it was about really, and adequate sleep was another interesting area, apart from emotional well-being, by the way. That also is a big trend that we see. Yeah. If I look at, and we work with so many ingredients, in terms of the product development work that we do, one of the key benefits, obviously, within the well-being space was, of course, immunity. And if I look at, some of the data that I was seeing, that, in Asia Pacific alone, about 34% of the food and drink supplement launches were around the claim of immunity. Yeah. So just people had that fear of COVID, and then you said, okay, I have this, I'm more immune, and therefore, the risk of getting in COVID, etc., would be, lower. The other reason we believe that it's also happening is, if you look at COVID, I think the fact that the risk of having sort of morbid, comorbid situations, you are likely to have COVID more. That has led to a lot of people becoming a lot more conscious about the fact that they need to take actions on, reducing the risk of diabetes or improving the immunity and so on. Proteins and adaptogens is one thing that we've seen is a huge thing. And in fact, I'll talk very quickly about the work that we are doing at this space. A lot of work in not just protein as plant protein, dairy protein, and so on, but overall bringing protein. And this was there pre-COVID. We see this continuing even post-COVID. But the space of adaptogens is something that is certainly was there earlier. So if I look at the US, I think turmeric, ashwagandha, this is Indian traditional medicine herbs. These are very, very high out there. And if you look at the traditional Chinese medicines as well, there is a lot of that. But the fact is the number of launches and products that we're seeing with that is higher. The question will always be about efficacy. The question will always be how effective are these, or is it just a drop of turmeric and stuff like that and making an immunity claim? And I think that's one of the challenge areas that maybe I will talk about later. When it comes to food made at home, we of course have seen a whole series of innovations happening in this space about ready-to-cook meals, bringing grandma's recipes, about natural food, something that cooks in 15 minutes, it's ready, and the same thing with ready-to-eat as well. So I think this is an interesting space. Plant-based, like Japnit as well mentioned, that we see this as a pretty sort of, it's still growing, it's early days, but I think we definitely are seeing a lot of launches coming this way. And this is something that we've been personally working on, loads of project briefs in either a plant milk or a plant meat, egg replacement and stuff like that. So that's something that we're looking at. People are also looking at saying, how can we fortify some of these things so that, it's sort of, it's while there is plant meat based stuff, but it's also healthier and so on. And also the other part of it we're seeing from a sustainability perspective is not just this, but also a lot of looking at sustainable crops like millets, like seaweeds, like, sort of a lot of other crops, etc., that people are looking at saying, can you make better products with that? So that's another area on sustainability that we see. So just a very quick thing in terms of some of the launches we did from our portfolio over the last 1 year. So we actually did have a lot of launches in the areas of breakfast cereals that we helped launch, which was either in immunity, it was in energy, and we're looking at various other platforms. We did the first launch of a very high protein snack, which was from plant protein, 100% plant protein, vegan, and all of that. We do see beverages as another space where we're seeing a lot of stuff around immunity and using adaptogens, and that's something that we're working on. Kids as a space is a space where we're seeing a lot of innovation beginning to happen. And so we're seeing dairy. So we did for somebody in the space of dairy for children, and then the whole space of ready to cook curries and meals and stuff like that is what we've seen. What's working right now in our kitchens is stuff around adaptogens. There's a lot of work that we're doing in this space, which is using traditional Indian herbs, traditional Chinese herbs, and looking at efficacious ways of bringing them in food formats. We're working on a lot of briefs on plant, whether it's plant meat, like I said, plant milk, it's egg replacement and so on. The other big space that we're working on is actually on the whole area of specific areas like diabetes, weight reduction and stuff like that, and overall health and well-being. I think that is going to be here for some time to stay. The whole space of cooking at home, etc., is going to be here for some time to stay. And like Japnit mentioned, plant protein, early days, but it's sort of inching up, that people are becoming a lot more conscious. But the fact is people are making those decisions also based partly on from a sustainable perspective as well. So thank you so much for the listen, and I hope I didn't exceed my time, Marie. And let's get on with your question.
No, not at all. I was just joking. Thank you so much. That's been a really interesting presentation. Actually, off the cuff, I have a question for you, Rinka. With all these wonderful products, what are the opportunities, for food companies are there in health and nutrition particularly?
Yeah, so like I mentioned, I think in the health and wellness space itself, we are seeing large amounts of opportunities. Like I said, in the space of health and wellness and immunity, or whether it's specific conditions. And like I said, when you have comorbid conditions like diabetes or a heart health and so on, people are becoming a lot more conscious of saying, how do I reduce my risk so I have lesser risk of getting infections and things like that. So I think that's an interesting space. People are going back to the use of natural ingredients. So whether it is herbs, whether it's garlic, whether it's ginger, things like that. So people are going back to natural, people are going back to home remedies. Yeah. And I think that's an interesting space for companies to look at. How do you bring some of those learnings into a packaged format, which is convenient? Because like Japnit mentioned, convenience is going to be a big driver. So how can I get all of that packed into a good food format, which is clean and labeled, which is not loaded with a lot of other harmful stuff, things like that. So that's an interesting space for companies. The other space is also consumers of different segments. So there are kids on one end, where we see that's an interesting space to look at. Geriatrics is another space that there aren't that many products out there, and that's a space that we find very, very interesting for companies to look at. So like that. And then of course there is ready to cook and ready to eat solutions and things like that. So I think it would be quite an interesting, really a sort of opportunity for companies across categories of foods.
Okay. Well, we've got some questions from the audience, so I thought maybe we'll address that before we go into panel discussion. The first one being, Asian consumers conscious of country of origin for their food product? So I think over to Rinka and Japnit.
My observations has been that consciousness has increased. I mean, it started off with not that much consciousness, but now the food companies are saying it as well. So when they talk about the ingredient consciousness that's happening, it's not just what's in it, but also where from. COVID sort of brought the whole China thing into light, and I think people are just concerned about products coming from China. But yeah, we're seeing that evolve. I don't know, Rinka, you sound like you're going to disagree with me, but
no, I'm not going to agree with. I think it's evolving in Asia, but and we were recently doing some consumer work in the United States, and there we found actually people were very, very vocal about saying, is this produced from local farms in the US? Is this produced, and this was in Canada as well, and the same thing. In where I am right now in India, and we're seeing a lot of community farms evolving. So you have communities, within communities, you have people coming and delivering the vegetables, and every Saturday or Sunday, whatever that is, they would come and they'd say, okay, this is organically produced. And that's going back to what Lionel was talking about, right? Is about saying, how do I get from, these kind of farms straight into my home? So they want to know that I got it straight from them, and I don't know where the other stuff is coming. So it is increasing, but I think it's important.
Okay, well, that kind of leads us into the second question from the audience. Do Asian consumers navigate towards Western brands for food ingredients instead of local manufacturers? It does seem like, from what I've heard so far, it's a no. Someone like to jump on that?
Can I just get the question again? I didn't.
Do Asian consumers navigate towards Western brands for food ingredients instead of local manufacturers?
Yes and no, I would say. And when I get a lot of briefs, right, I do get a lot of briefs sometimes from startups who would say, oh, this sells, and this is the ingredient that sells very well in the US, etc. My question is always about, let's look at what's local, what's available here. And, but it is important to celebrate what's local, and I think that's something that we're seeing from a consumer perspective. They are, like I said, going back to home remedies. They're going back to what's naturally available in, my area and stuff like that. I think so. It is something that's important. And I think that's something that companies should look for. They should celebrate what's local, while, yeah, there are certain things which are very scientifically validated and proven. So let's say it's a particular ingredient for, I don't know, I'm just saying cholesterol reduction or whatever. That is where people look for validation, that this is a validated international product, and therefore I would trust that a lot more. But we do see a lot of consumers today saying this is locally produced, it's locally sourced. That is also, becoming quite important.
So Southeast Asian consumers, do they discern between healthy food and organic food?
You want Lionel to take that? Sorry.
Yeah, I think Asian consumers' preference towards like brands in general, I would say it varies and it really depends on a pretty wide spectrum. And it's also depending on the category of product or that you're looking at. Right? For example, if you're talking about pharmaceuticals, right? No doubt, like it's going to be Western brand, preferred, right? Like if you go to China, for example, right? Would you take a local version of Coca-Cola? Probably not. You're gonna take Coca-Cola regardless of where you are, right? There are certain brands that work like globally regardless of geography. But at the same time, if it's something that is something very localized and something very specific to cultures, then I think obviously there's going to be a lot more local preference for something that relates to like a local context. Yeah.
Okay. Actually, we have a question for Lionel. It says there seems to be a growing trend of household planting and harvesting their own herbs, spices, etc. How will this impact the F&B industry?
Yeah, I don't think it will impact the F&B industry at all. Growing at home is a hobby. It's not commercially viable, from a unit economics perspective. Yes, you can feed the family and all that, but it's not going to impact the F&B industry. Not a little bit at all.
Okay. Now, let me see. Sorry, let me go through. Actually, I'd like to address the issue of sustainability, which I caught on earlier. When Lionel, you were talking about corporates coming into farming, and because of control over supply chain. I'd actually like to touch on sustainability for all our speakers. But starting off with Lionel, would that actually lend? Are they looking at it being sustainable for the environment?
So yeah, like that. So I'll give you a personal experience, right? So I do have a separate business in F&B. So we are downstream of where we are as a farming business, right? So we deal with like food services all the time, right? So when COVID happened, obviously, not just because of lockdown, but you cannot get, goods from Europe to be shipped to, Asia, right? So all your products are stuck at the port, and especially for perishables, they're just basically waiting to be spoiled, essentially, right? So I think like with the lockdown, there was kind of, I wouldn't say like a realization point for companies, especially food services, when they're dealing with like contracts when they cannot actually fulfill those contracts. The liabilities for them, regardless of whether there's COVID or not, like the contracts are there and they still have to serve them. So I think that's got a lot of companies thinking how to, find other strategies to deal with this. Whether is it getting further upstream in terms of controlling their production or like the supplies, or like finding other methodologies to find alternate means to get hold of certain products. So I think it's a very interesting one in the sense where like corporates are coming in now, not just because they see the value in the return on investments in farming, but essentially there's more than that. So that's actually a good thing, I think. And one of the biggest challenges with new farmers is like they have no idea how to penetrate the market because they have no sales channels and they are all operating on the same economics, right? Sure, you might have scale, but end of the day, you need sales channels, and that's one of the things that a lot of new players struggle with. With corporates coming in that already have a foot in the game, especially if they're downstream, distribution solution, it's actually a very easy, strategy to actually integrate. Yeah.
I wanted to just jump on that a little bit, and Lionel brought up this very interesting point. So interestingly, the challenge in the food sector to a very large extent isn't so much food production, or when I say food or food security, it isn't so much food production. It's really the supply chain, especially for perishables. I remember, I'm trying to grasp the number, but I don't remember it right now. But India, so India produces enough rice for the entire population to eat, but a third of it, or a number like that, a third of it is eaten by rats in the warehouses.
Right.
Indonesia, the oranges that are imported in are cheaper than the oranges that are produced in Indonesia because of supply chain, because it's just hard to get access to market, So a lot of the dynamics actually in the food sector are around cold storage and linkages between cities and markets and things like that.
A good example now that you mentioned that, like if you look at the Philippines, they're made of so many islands, right? They are one of the countries with the biggest challenges in supply chain. The country itself can produce a lot, but they cannot even get it to communities that the markets, right?
Yeah.
That's why like food costs there is still pretty high. And maybe that's why it's reflected in the trends that you've gathered in the data, like why they are like less successful than the other Asian countries.
That's true.
If I just can add on another point onto this, I think, and I think both of you just brought on a very interesting area when you have food wastage, and in Asia we have a lot of that. I mean, like you mentioned about India, but a significant part is food wastage. Indonesia would be the same. The whole thing is around how do you, in some ways, upcycle some of these wasted produce, whether it is crops or fruits and vegetables and so on, and be able to convert them into value-added products or convert them into get more access, like Lionel mentioned. I mean, if you look at a lot of the people who are not even having, 3 square meals or whatever a day, is there a way you can bring access? So I think there's a whole thing around supply chain which can make it economically viable to do this, because I think when the moment you talk about upcycle and the moment you talk about saying sustainable processing and stuff like that, the costs go up. Consumers are not willing to pay the money to get that whole benefit. While yes, as a company, it's very important to stay for a position, stand for that position, and say that so we're doing all these sustainable practices and so on. But is the consumer willing to pay an add-on price for that? So I think there's a huge another challenge from a supply chain perspective to see how do you make it economically viable. No, but is that for Asia? Is that big? I think it's huge. So I think that's something that we really absolutely need to look at.
Well, the hour is almost up, so just one last question for our panel. Now, there's been a shift in consumers' preference towards wellness, healthier food, alternative diets. What's your take on this? Will this trend persist after we've all get vaccinated and conquered COVID? Anyone?
Yeah, I don't think, I think COVID simply just accelerated the process. I don't think it changes anything. It's an ongoing trend anyway. I think there's a lot of other overriding macro factors that are more influential than just COVID alone. But I think, COVID is probably one of the advantages of COVID to make us realize this.
Yeah. I would agree with him. I think some of the changes and trends behaviors that we see are here to stay. So people are going back to dining outside, things like that. Those are increasing, and it's good that people are beginning to go back and enjoy their life a little bit better. But I think some of the things in terms of purchase decisions, things like that, which is why I mentioned like people becoming a lot more value conscious, because I think we had moved away from being very value conscious to being a bit of, splurge on the go, so that kind of stuff. So I think those little bit of behavior changes that we're seeing are probably here to stay, and that's going to influence purchase decisions and therefore the kind of products that keep coming out. So I think my view is that it is here to stay for some time to come.
Yeah, the only thing that I'll add to that is it's not just here to stay. It was here before COVID. So, McDonald's realized that they need to do more healthy things and start offering fruits and things. I mean, well before COVID. Yeah. Coca-Cola, Pepsi diversified from sugary drinks into fruit and water and all these other products well before COVID. So Lionel's right. This is not something created by the pandemic. It's just been accelerated. It's just been brought to our attention.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's here to stay.
Great. Good. We'll have a healthier future ahead of us. Now, thank you all, my wonderful panel of speakers. And that's all we have for today. Thank you to our audience as well for joining us. We hope that you'll find this webinar informative and useful. If you have any questions, please drop us a line at spire@spireresearch.com. Thanks again, and keep safe, everyone.